The Texas sun beat down on Elias, just as it had every day since he could remember. But these days, the warmth felt hollow, unable to reach the cold ache in his chest. It was 1883, and the vast, dusty plains of West Texas were his home, though it hadn't felt like one since Martha was gone. His wife, his bright star, had faded with the last autumn leaves, leaving him a widower with nothing but memories and the endless work of the ranch. Elias was known as a quiet man, but his hands spoke volumes. They were strong, callous from years of mending fences, branding cattle, and coaxing life from stubborn land. He was a ranch hand, true and steady, always ready to lend a hand, always fair in his dealings. Folks around the small town of Redemption Gap respected him, even if they didn't know the depth of the sorrow he carried. Each sunrise brought a new wave of loneliness, each sunset a reminder of the empty chair by the fire. He'd often sit on the porch swing, the wood creaking a slow, sad rhythm, and stare out at the horizon, imagining Martha beside him, her gentle laugh echoing in the quiet evening air. He missed her touch, her voice, the way she'd hum a little tune while cooking supper. Their small cabin, once filled with her warmth and the scent of fresh-baked bread, now felt too big, too still. He'd try to keep it as she left it, but dust gathered in corners she would have never allowed, and the flowers she'd planted by the window drooped, mirroring his own spirit. Sometimes he'd catch a glimpse of her old apron, hanging on a peg by the door, and a sharp pang would shoot through him, a reminder of all he had lost. His work was his only solace. He'd rise before dawn, saddle his horse, buck, and ride out into the vast emptiness, pushing himself until exhaustion claimed him. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the emotional pain. He'd spend hours checking on the cattle, fixing a broken gate, or chasing down a stray. The cattle, with their wide, calm eyes, were good company in their own way. They didn't ask questions, didn't remind him of his loss. They simply grazed, living their simple lives, a stark contrast to the turmoil within him. Yet, even in his grief, Elias maintained a quiet dignity. He always made sure his horses were fed, his gear was in good order, and his part of the ranch was well tended. He was a man of his word, and his integrity was as solid as the Texas rock formations. He never imagined that this quiet, honorable life would soon be turned upside down, that the very cattle he tended would become the center of a terrible accusation, pushing him to the brink of despair. His world, already fractured by loss, was about to shatter completely. One sweltering afternoon, as Elias was mending a section of barbed wire that had come loose, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. It wasn't the usual sight of a lone rider or a small group of cowboys. This was a larger, more determined cloud, growing quickly, revealing a posse of men on horseback, led by a stern-faced deputy. Elias paused, a knot forming in his stomach. He'd never had trouble with the law, but the air felt heavy with unspoken threat. The deputy dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. "Elias Thorne?" he asked, his voice rough. "That's me," Elias replied, his voice calm despite his unease. "We have reason to believe you've been rustling cattle," the deputy stated, his eyes hard. "A large number of head went missing from the Miller Ranch last week, and tracks lead right to your property line." Elias felt a shock run through him. "Rustling? That's impossible. I wouldn't steal a fly, let alone a herd of cattle." He looked around at his own small, honest herd, grazing peacefully. The accusation was like a punch to the gut. He had always worked hard for every dime, every cow. But the deputy wasn't listening. He pulled out a warrant, its official seal glaring in the sunlight. Before Elias could protest further, his hands were cuffed behind his back. The world seemed to spin. The familiar landscape of his ranch, the place where he had built a life with Martha, now felt alien, threatening. He was led away, Buck whinnying softly from his corral, sensing the distress. In the small, dusty jailhouse of Redemption Gap, Elias was thrown into a cold cell. The iron bars felt like a cage around his heart. The accusation of rustling was a heavy weight, heavier even than his grief for Martha. How could anyone believe such a thing? He spent days in that cell, the silence broken only by the distant braying of a donkey or the creak of the jailer's boots. He tried to think, to remember anything that could explain the tracks, but his mind was a blur of shock and disbelief. His trial was swift, almost brutally so. The evidence presented against him seemed overwhelming, though Elias knew it was all wrong. The tracks, the timing, a neighbor's half-heard rumor, it all painted a picture of a desperate man turning to crime. His quiet nature, once seen as respectful, was now interpreted as secretive. The judge, a man with tired eyes, listened to the testimonies and then, with a heavy sigh, delivered the verdict. Guilty. The word echoed in the small courtroom. Elias stood, stunned, as the judge pronounced his sentence. He was to be hanged by the neck until dead, at dawn, 3 days hence. The world outside the jail cell had already felt bleak, but now it had become a terrifying, final darkness. He was going to die for a crime he didn't commit, leaving Martha's memory to be tarnished by a thief's reputation. The thought was unbearable. Across town, in her office, Sheriff Sarah felt a heavy weight settle in her heart. She was a woman of strong will and an even stronger sense of duty, a rare sight in the rough-and-tumble world of 1883 Texas. Her badge, polished bright, shone against her plain but sturdy clothes, a symbol of the law she upheld without fear or favor. She had seen much in her time as sheriff, disputes, brawls, and even murder, but never had a case felt quite so unsettling as that of Elias Thorne. She knew Elias. Not well, perhaps, but enough to know he was a quiet, honest man. He was the kind of man who would offer help without being asked, whose word was his bond. The news of his wife's passing had reached her, and she had seen the sorrow in his eyes during the few times their paths had crossed since. Now, to think of him as a cattle thief condemned to die, it just didn't sit right. Sarah reread the judge's order, her brow furrowed. The evidence had seemed solid enough in court. Tracks leading to his land, a witness claiming to have seen a lone rider near the Miller Ranch that night. But something about it gnawed at her. Elias hadn't seemed like a man capable of such a crime, let alone one who would risk everything for a few stolen cows. He had always been so steady, so predictable in his honesty. She walked to the window of her office, looking out at the dusty street. The gallows, newly built at the edge of town, stood stark against the fading daylight. It was a grim reminder of her job, a duty that sometimes asked her to do things she didn't want to. She had to carry out the law, no matter how much her gut told her something was wrong. Her town needed order, and she was the one who kept it. She couldn't let personal feelings get in the way of justice, even if that justice felt cold and unfair. A sigh escaped her lips. She had questioned the deputy who brought Elias in, gone over the reports, but found no holes. The case was closed, the verdict delivered. It was her responsibility to see it through. She thought of Elias in his cell, a man she believed to be good, now facing death. It was a heavy burden, one that made her strong shoulders ache. She picked up a worn leather-bound book from her desk, the county record of cattle brands. It was a habit, a way to clear her head, to focus on the small, clear facts when the bigger picture felt blurry. She flipped through the pages, her finger tracing the intricate designs, each one a mark of ownership, a piece of someone's livelihood. She knew she had to be strong, to do her duty, even if it meant sending an honorable man to his end. The thought was a bitter taste in her mouth. The morning of the hanging dawned clear and cold, a sharp contrast to the heat of the previous days. A hush had fallen over Redemption Gap. People gathered slowly, a silent crowd forming around the gallows, their faces solemn. Elias was led from his cell, his movements slow but steady. He wore his usual work clothes, a faded blue shirt and worn trousers, as if he were simply heading out for another day on the ranch. His gaze was distant, fixed on some unseen point beyond the horizon, beyond the gallows, perhaps seeing Martha's face in the rising sun. Sheriff Sarah stood near the gallows, her presence firm and unmoving, but inside, a storm raged. The bitter taste from the night before had not left her. Every step Elias took toward the rope felt like a heavy blow to her conscience. Her duty demanded she be here, to oversee this grim event, but her heart rebelled against it. She watched the executioner, a man named Jedediah, adjust the noose with practiced, unfeeling hands. The rough wood of the gallows seemed to loom larger with each passing moment, casting a long shadow over the scene. Just as Elias reached the platform, his eyes finally met Sarah's. In his gaze, she saw not anger or fear, but a deep, weary resignation. It was the look of a man who had already lost too much and now simply awaited the inevitable. That look, so unlike a guilty man's defiance, tightened the knot of doubt in Sarah's stomach. She knew the law, she knew the evidence, but she also knew the man standing before her. A sudden, sharp urge made her move. It was a small thing, a flicker of instinct that had saved her many times before. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper she had brought with her, the official list of the rustled cattle, complete with their brands. She had looked at it countless times, memorized every detail, but a voice inside her head whispered, asterisk just one more time. Star. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the paper. The deputy had compiled it quickly, a hurried scrawl of descriptions and brands from the Miller Ranch. Her eyes scanned the list, moving over the familiar symbols. The Miller M brand, the Circle R brand, the Double Bar. And then her breath caught. A brand, right there in the middle of the list, that wasn't from the Miller Ranch. It was a brand she recognized, one that stood out like a beacon in the sea of strange marks. A small, elegant M with a delicate flower intertwined. It was Martha Thorne's brand, a brand Elias's late wife had designed and registered herself, for the few head of cattle she had owned, a gift from Elias when they married. It wasn't a Miller brand. It was Elias's herd. Or rather, Martha's herd, now Elias's. The cattle listed as stolen from the Miller Ranch included some of Elias's own. The discovery hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning, sharp and undeniable. Her eyes fixed on the M with a flower brand, a symbol she knew belonged to Martha Thorne. It was as clear as the morning sky. This wasn't a mistake. It was a grave error, a terrible oversight that had brought an innocent man to the brink of death. The paper trembled in her hand, not from fear, but from the sudden, powerful rush of truth. A cold sweat broke out on her brow, despite the chill in the air. How could this have happened? How could such a crucial detail be missed? The deputy, in his haste to secure a conviction, must have simply listed all the cattle found near Elias's property as stolen, without checking their true ownership against the county records. Sarah, in her own rush to uphold the law, had relied on his report, not verifying every single brand herself. A wave of sickening guilt washed over her. She had almost allowed an innocent man to be hanged, a man whose quiet honesty she had instinctively trusted all along. Her mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. Elias wouldn't have stolen his own cattle. It made no sense. The tracks leading to his property must have been for these very cows, his own small herd, which had perhaps wandered or been rounded up mistakenly with the Millers. The whole case, built on what seemed like solid evidence, crumbled in an instant, revealed as a cruel, tragic misunderstanding. The crowd stirred, impatient for the execution to begin. Jedediah, the executioner, was already placing the noose around Elias's neck. Elias stood still, his eyes still holding that weary resignation, completely unaware of the furious realization dawning in the sheriff's mind. There was no time to lose. Every second counted. Sarah's voice, usually calm and steady, exploded across the silent square. Stop! Hold the execution! Her shout cut through the stillness, startling everyone. Jedediah froze, his hand still on the rope. The crowd murmured, confused, turning their heads to stare at the sheriff. Elias, too, looked up, his eyes meeting hers, a flicker of surprise replacing the emptiness. Sarah pushed through the small group of deputies, her badge glinting, her face pale but determined. She held up the crumpled paper, her hand shaking slightly as she pointed to the telltale brand. This list, she announced, her voice ringing with authority, it's wrong. This brand here, she jabbed her finger at the M with a flower, belongs to Martha Thorne. These are Elias's cattle, not stolen from the Miller Ranch. A stunned silence fell over the square, heavier than before. The deputy who had arrested Elias looked bewildered, then horrified. The judge, who had just arrived, pushed his way forward, his eyes widening as he recognized the brand Sarah was pointing to. The truth, once hidden, was now laid bare for all to see. Elias was innocent. The sudden, absolute silence that followed Sarah's declaration was broken only by the whisper of the wind. The crowd, moments ago a sea of grim faces, now stared, mouths agape, at the sheriff and the list in her hand. Elias, still standing on the gallows with the noose around his neck, looked as if he had just woken from a long dream. His eyes, wide with disbelief, slowly shifted from Sarah to the stunned faces of the judge and the deputy. Sarah felt a profound wave of relief, mixed with a crushing sense of guilt. The relief was for Elias, for the life she had just saved. The guilt was for her own role, for the near-fatal oversight. Her strong hand trembled as she lowered the paper. "Jedediah, unfasten that rope," she ordered, her voice firm despite the tremor. The executioner, pale and shaken, quickly obeyed, his movements clumsy. As the noose was removed, Elias rubbed his neck, a bewildered expression on his face. He was free, but the reality of how close he had come to death, and the injustice of it all, was slowly sinking in. Sarah stepped onto the platform, her gaze meeting his. "Elias, I'm truly sorry," she said, her voice softer now, filled with genuine remorse. "We made a terrible mistake. You're innocent." The judge, a man usually composed, stammered, "Sheriff, is this truly so?" "Yes, Judge," Sarah confirmed, holding out the paper. "The brand on this list, the M with a flower, is registered to Martha Thorne. These are not stolen cattle. They're Elias's own small herd." The deputy clearly failed to verify the brands when compiling his report. This man was about to be hanged for owning his own property. The judge took the paper, his face turning red with shame and anger at the deputy. The crowd, now understanding the enormity of the error, began to murmur, their shock turning to outrage. They had almost witnessed the hanging of an innocent man, one of their own. Sarah, however, felt only the burning shame of her own near failure. She was the law, the protector of justice, and she had almost failed spectacularly. The weight of that responsibility and the guilt for Elias's suffering pressed down on her. She had let her duty blind her to her instincts, almost costing a good man his life. It was a mistake she would never forget, a lesson etched deep into her very soul. She knew she had to make it right, not just for Elias, but for the very idea of justice she held so dear. This was not just about saving a life. It was about mending a broken trust, both in the eyes of the community and within herself. Elias, though safe, still looked lost, like a man adrift after a storm. Sarah knew her duty to him wasn't over. It had just begun. With the noose removed and the crowd still buzzing, Sheriff Sarah turned fully to Elias. His face was a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. The color was slowly returning to his cheeks, but the ordeal had clearly left its mark. Sarah knew an apology wasn't enough, not for a man who had stared death in the face because of her department's error. "Elias Thorne," she began, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the lingering murmurs of the crowd. "You are a free man. Your name is cleared. The court's judgment against you is hereby overturned." She looked at the judge, who nodded grimly, already moving to address the crowd and issue official orders. Then, Sarah turned back to Elias, her eyes holding his. "But more than that," she continued, her voice softening slightly, "I owe you. The town owes you. We almost let a terrible injustice happen." She paused, searching for the right words to convey the depth of her regret and the seriousness of her offer. "Your ranch, your small herd, they'll be returned to you, of course. But I know that might not be enough to mend what's been broken." She took a deep breath. "My own ranch, the Bar S, it's just outside of town. I run it mostly myself, with a few hired hands, but I could always use someone I can trust, someone with your skill and honesty." She extended a hand towards him, a gesture of both apology and a new beginning. Elias, I would be honored if you would come work for me. Honestly, good pay, good conditions. It would give you a chance to start fresh, and it would give me a chance to truly make amends for this terrible wrong. Elias stared at her hand, then at her face. The offer was unexpected, a lifeline thrown into the dark waters he had been treading. He had lost so much, not just his wife, but almost his life and his good name. The thought of going back to his empty cabin, to his small, lonely ranch, filled him with a fresh wave of despair. But Sarah's offer, it was a chance perhaps to rebuild, to find a new purpose. He saw the earnestness in her eyes, the genuine desire to right a wrong. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, a silent acceptance. "Sheriff," he said, his voice a little hoarse, I accept. Thank you." A small, genuine smile touched Sarah's lips. It was a smile of relief, of hope, and of a renewed commitment to the justice she believed in. She had saved a life, and now she had offered a path to healing. The crowd watched the exchange, a sense of relief washing over them too. The dark cloud that had hung over Redemption Gap had lifted, replaced by the promise of a new, unexpected chapter. Elias was free, and his future, though still uncertain, no longer ended at the gallows. It began anew on Sheriff Sarah's ranch. Life on the Bar S ranch was different for Elias, yet familiar in its rhythms. The sun still rose and set, the cattle still needed tending, and the fences always seemed to need mending. But instead of the lonely silence of his own small spread, he now shared the work with Sarah and her few other ranch hands. He was still quiet, the deep sadness for Martha a shadow that never quite left him, but a flicker of hope had been rekindled. He was grateful to Sarah, profoundly so, for saving his life and offering him a chance to rebuild. Sarah, for her part, watched Elias carefully. The guilt of her near mistake still weighed on her, driving her to ensure he was treated with the utmost fairness and respect. She saw the quiet strength in him, the way he worked tirelessly, never complaining, always doing more than asked. He had a natural way with the animals, a calm demeanor that put even the most skittish horse at ease. She observed him mending a broken gate with a precision that spoke of years of honest labor, a true craftsman of the land. At first, their talk was short, mostly about ranch business, the condition of a fence line, the health of a calf, the best way to move a herd. But slowly, as days turned into weeks, their conversations grew longer. Sarah found herself asking Elias's advice on ranch matters, trusting his experienced judgment. He, in turn, began to offer small observations about the weather or a clever solution to a problem, his voice gaining a little more strength with each shared thought. One evening, after a long day of branding, they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the stars begin to the vast Texas sky. Sarah offered him a cup of coffee, and for the first time, Elias spoke about Martha, not with overwhelming grief, but with a gentle fondness, sharing a story about her knack for finding lost calves. Sarah listened intently, offering a quiet understanding that made Elias feel less alone than he had in a long time. He, in turn, learned about Sarah's struggles to run a ranch in a man's world, the challenges she faced as a female sheriff, and her unwavering belief in fairness. He saw the strength in her, but also the moments of weariness, the quiet determination that sometimes hid a deep burden. He began to trust her, not just as his employer, but as a person who genuinely cared for justice and for the well-being of others, even a man she had almost condemned. The scars of his past ordeal were still there, a constant reminder, but the wounds were slowly beginning to heal. Working alongside Sarah, seeing her dedication and integrity, helped him to believe in good again. And Sarah, watching Elias slowly come back to life, felt not just relief, but a growing respect and admiration for the man she had almost lost. Their connection, forged in the crucible of near tragedy, was deepening into something sturdy and real. As seasons changed over the Bar S ranch, so too did the atmosphere between Elias and Sarah. The initial formal politeness slowly melted away, replaced by an easy camaraderie. They found themselves sharing more than just ranch duties. During long rides, checking fence lines, or while taking a break under the shade of a mesquite tree, stories began to flow. Elias, once so guarded, started to recount tales of his youth, of growing up on a small farm in East Texas, and even some light-hearted memories of Martha. Sarah would listen, her gaze soft, sometimes adding a story of her own childhood, full of adventures and scrapes that made Elias chuckle, a sound that had been missing from his life for far too long. He discovered that beneath her tough sheriff exterior, Sarah had a dry wit and a playful spirit. He'd tease her about her stubbornness when she refused to take a break, and she'd playfully retort about his endless coffee drinking. Laughter, gentle at first, then more frequent and hearty, began to fill the ranch. It echoed from the corrals during branding, drifted from the bunkhouse during supper, and mingled with the crackle of the evening fire. Elias found himself looking forward to these moments, to Sarah's sharp observations and the way her eyes would crinkle at the corners when she smiled. He felt a lightness he hadn't thought possible, a warmth that slowly pushed back the cold grip of grief. Sarah, in turn, appreciated Elias's quiet strength and his steady presence. She respected his wisdom and the way he handled every task with care. She learned about his love for reading, how he'd carry a worn book in his saddlebag, and his surprising talent for playing the harmonica, its sweet, mournful tunes often drifting across the ranch at twilight. She started leaving books she thought he might like on his bunk, small gestures that spoke volumes. One particularly grueling day, after a sudden storm had scattered a part of the herd, they worked side by side for hours, soaked to the bone and caked in mud, rounding up the strays. When the last calf was safely back in the corral, they collapsed onto the porch, exhausted but triumphant. Sarah looked at Elias, his face streaked with dirt, but his eyes shining with shared success, and a genuine, easy laugh bubbled up from her. Elias joined in, his own laughter deep and resonant, a pure sound of joy that felt utterly new. In that moment, a feeling stronger than simple gratitude or respect settled between them. It was a comfortable, deep sense of belonging, a friendship that felt as natural and vital as the Texas landscape itself. They had faced a storm together, both literally and figuratively, and emerged stronger, their bond woven tighter with shared effort and burgeoning affection. The past, though still a part of them, no longer defined their every moment. A new story was unfolding, one written in shared smiles, whispered confidences, and the quiet understanding that grew between two souls finding unexpected solace in each other. The easy friendship between Elias and Sarah deepened with each passing day. It was a slow, natural unfolding, like the bloom of a desert flower after a long rain. They found themselves seeking each other out, not just for work, but for the quiet comfort of shared presence. A glance across the dusty yard, a shared smile over a clever solution to a ranch problem, a long conversation under the vast, star-filled sky. Each moment wove a stronger thread between their hearts. Elias began to notice the small things about Sarah. The way her brow furrowed in concentration, the strength in her hands when she saddled a horse, the soft laugh that escaped her when he told a particularly dry joke. He admired her courage, her fairness, and the way she held her own in a world that often tried to push women aside. He realized that the emptiness Martha's passing had left was slowly, gently, being filled by a new, unexpected warmth. It wasn't replacing Martha, but it was a fresh, vital feeling that made him look forward to tomorrow. Sarah, too, felt a shift in her own heart. Elias's calm presence was a balm to her often stressed days. She found herself relying on his steady advice, not just for ranch matters, but for life's little puzzles. She admired his quiet resilience, the way he carried his past grief with dignity, yet still found joy in simple things. She saw the good man she had always believed him to be, now stronger, softer, and more open. When he played his harmonica by the campfire, the wistful tunes no longer sounded only of sorrow, but of hope and quiet strength. One evening, After a particularly beautiful sunset had painted the sky in fiery hues, they were sitting on the porch swing. The air was cool, scented with sagebrush. Elias had just finished a story about a particularly stubborn mule, making Sarah laugh. As her laughter faded, a comfortable silence settled between them. Elias looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just his boss, not just his friend, but a woman whose strength and kindness had brought him back from the brink. Sarah met his gaze, and in his eyes, she saw a depth of feeling that mirrored her own. It was a realization that bloomed in the quiet of the Texas evening, unspoken but undeniable. This wasn't just friendship anymore. It was something deeper, something tender and true. The idea, at first surprising, then wonderfully right, settled over them like the evening mist. They cared for each other, not just as companions in work, but with a growing, hopeful love. Elias reached out, his hand gently covering hers where it rested on the swing. Her fingers intertwined with his, a silent acceptance, a promise of a future they hadn't dared to imagine. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, witnessing the quiet birth of a new love in the heart of the Old West. Justice had brought them together, but love was now weaving their paths into one. With the quiet understanding shared on the porch swing, Elias and Sarah began a new journey together. Their love, born from a terrible injustice and nurtured through shared work and respect, grew stronger with each passing day. The town of Redemption Gap, having witnessed the near tragedy and the subsequent blossoming of their bond, watched with warmth and approval. It was a story that spoke of hope, a reminder that even in the toughest times, good things could find a way to bloom. A few months later, under a vast Texas sky, Elias and Sarah stood before a justice of the peace, surrounded by the small community that had once gathered at the gallows. But this time, the air was filled with joyous anticipation, not dread. Sarah, no longer in her sheriff's uniform, but a simple, elegant dress, looked radiant. Elias, his face alight with a happiness he thought he'd never feel again, wore a new suit, though his hands, still callous from ranch work, held hers gently. They exchanged vows, promises whispered under the shade of a sturdy oak tree, a symbol of their growing strength and roots. Elias felt Martha's memory not as a heavy weight, but as a gentle presence, a part of the past that had led him to this unexpected, beautiful future. He knew Martha would have wanted him to find happiness again. Their marriage was not just a joining of two people, but of two lives, two ranches, and two hearts that had both known loss and hardship. Elias brought his quiet wisdom and unmatched skill with cattle to the Bar S, making it thrive even more. Sarah continued her duties as sheriff, her sense of justice now tempered with a deeper understanding of human frailty and the power of second chances. They worked side by side, managing the ranch, supporting each other in their separate duties, and building a home filled with warmth and laughter. Their home, once Sarah's alone, now welcomed Elias's presence. The porch swing, where they had shared so many quiet moments, became a favorite spot for them to watch the sunsets, hand in hand. They talked about their days, their dreams, and the simple joys of their life together. Elias even picked up his harmonica again, the tunes now filled with a hopeful melody, a testament to the new joy he found. Their story became a legend in Redemption Gap, a testament to how even the darkest moments could lead to light. From the shadow of the gallows, where injustice almost claimed an innocent life, grew a love that healed old wounds and built a new family. Elias, the widowed ranch hand, and Sarah, the strong sheriff, found in each other a love as vast and enduring as the Texas plains, proving that justice, when truly sought, could indeed blossom into the most profound kind of love. They had found their happiness, together, a beautiful testament to resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring power of the human heart.